Why was she, the only one still sitting at the table when the alarms began to scream? Lieutenant Maya Henderson had been staring at the neat, familiar lines of her flight manual, its pages marked by years of study, repetition, and drills. For 247 hours she had flown the same patterns, training flights, patrols, simulations. Never once had she fired a real missile in anger. Never once had she felt the weight of knowing that lives depended on her alone. And yet, when the sirens split through the quiet dawn, her fingers froze on the page as if she had already been waiting for this sound, waiting for the one thing she'd never faced: war. The corridors of Thunderbolt Air Base shook with motion, boots hammering the polished floor, radios crackling with clipped voices. Men and women running past her with that particular mix of urgency and fear that only comes when a base realizes it is no longer secure. She rose slowly, almost too slowly, the manual still in her hand, and then let it fall closed. She followed the rush toward the operations center, the emergency lights painting everything in red pulses as if the entire building were bleeding. Enemy armor had been sighted. Not just a skirmish, not just a stray truck bristling with guns, but organized formations, tanks, artillery, missile systems, all moving in from three sides. It made no sense. They were too deep in friendly territory. No one had expected an assault here, and yet the screens in the ops center told no lies. Red icons crawling closer, dozens of them. She pressed in among the more seasoned pilots, men and women who had flown through fire, who had lost wingmen, who carried medals and scars she had only read about in profiles. She stood at the edge of the group, listening as Colonel James Morrison's voice cut through the tense buzz. 47 enemy vehicles, tanks, armored carriers, mobile missile launchers, an entire mechanized fist heading straight for their throats. The room smelled faintly of burned coffee, recycled air, and adrenaline. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face stayed composed, the way it always did. She had learned long ago that in a room full of veterans, showing nerves was the fastest way to be forgotten, or worse, dismissed. But then she heard the roll call of who was left. Captain Stevens gone on a classified mission, Major Thompson grounded, Lieutenant Jackson injured. The list grew thinner with each name. Her squadron was hollowed out, their numbers too few, their aircraft idle. She looked at the screen again, at the crawling enemy formations. If those tanks reached firing range, the base would be nothing but twisted metal and fire. People she had breakfast with just yesterday would be bodies under rubble. And still, not one pilot moved. Not one stepped forward. The silence thickened, suffocating. She didn't think, she spoke. "Sir, I'm available for immediate deployment." The words landed like a dropped rifle in a quiet room. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. For a heartbeat, even the radar screens seemed to hold their breath. Maya felt the weight of every gaze. The rookie, the textbook pilot, the one who knew the manual better than anyone but who had never once flown into hostile fire. She could almost hear their thoughts. She'll get herself killed. She'll get us killed. Colonel Morrison's jaw tightened. His eyes measured her as though he was weighing her against the wall of red advancing on the map. "Lieutenant Henderson," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "This isn't a training flight over friendly skis. You're volunteering to fly close air support against an armored force equipped with advanced surface-to-air missiles. You've never seen combat, not once. Do you understand what that means?" She swallowed but didn't let her voice waver. "Yes, sir, I understand." Her chest was tight, but there was a strange calm in the center of it. She knew the math. She knew the odds. But she also knew that every second wasted was another second closer to fire raining down on the people behind her. She thought of the maintenance crews, the radar techs, the cooks, the medics, faces she passed in the halls every day. They didn't have jets to climb into. They didn't have a choice. "Your combat experience," Morrison continued, "is zero. No hostile engagements. No live ordnance deployed, not once under fire." "Correct, sir." The silence pressed harder, thick as smoke. Then a voice over the radio broke it, urgent, almost panicked. Base command, this is Overwatch 7. Enemy armor visible at grid 44 Bravo, 40+ vehicles. Request immediate air support before they reach firing range. The colonel's eyes flicked back to her, then to the tactical screen, then to her again. There was no time left to debate. His face hardened into the grim mask of a commander forced into an impossible choice. Lieutenant Henderson, you're authorized for immediate combat deployment. Lightning 77 is fueled and armed. May God help us all. The words hit her with the force of a catapult. For years she had imagined what it would feel like to be cleared for combat. She had thought it would be triumph, validation, proof that she belonged. But now, as she turned and sprinted for the flight line, it felt like weight pressing into her shoulders, heavier than her flight gear, heavier than the helmet tucked under her arm. On the tarmac, her F-35 gleamed in the harsh floodlights, its skin a dark mirror of angular stealth, the product of billions of dollars and countless promises of invulnerability. She had walked around jets like this hundreds of times. She had touched the panels, memorized the weapon systems, rehearsed the checklists until she could recite them in her sleep. But tonight it wasn't a checklist. It was life or death. Staff Sergeant Kevin Walsh met her at the nose of the aircraft. He looked at her not as a pilot, but as someone walking toward a storm. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He knew what she was about to face. You're loaded with 8 Hellfires, 2 cluster bombs, and 500 rounds of 25mm cannon, he said, walking her through the weapons. Hellfires will take out tanks at 6 kilometers if they're moving, 8 if they're still. Cannon's good to 2 kilometers, but you'll be inside missile range at that point. Lieutenant, I won't lie, it's dangerous. More dangerous than anything you've trained for. She nodded, forcing her focus into the familiar rhythm of preparation. Numbers, ranges, angles, things she could control. What's our time before they reach firing positions? 25 minutes, maybe less, Walsh replied. After that, they'll be hitting hangars, fuel, command. And Lieutenant, they've got T-90s, guns that can hit us from 4 kilometers out. Once they're in range, they can tear this place apart piece by piece. She strapped into the cockpit. The canopy closed over her like a coffin lid and a shield all at once. The displays lit up, green and gold, her own heartbeat reflected in the faint hum of the systems coming alive. The whine of the Pratt & Whitney engine filled her bones. She ran through the startup, hands moving faster than thought, each switch a ritual that steadied her against the storm. From the tower, Lightning 77, you are cleared for immediate departure. Good hunting, Lieutenant. The words crackled in her ears as the jet roared forward. The runway blurred. Her body pressed back into the seat. And then weightlessness. The ground fell away, the base shrinking beneath her, the sky opening like an uncharted sea. From up here, the world looked fragile. The outer perimeter still shook from enemy artillery, flashes of fire against the pre-dawn dark. Convoys of soldiers moved below, ant-like, scrambling to reinforce defenses that might not hold. And beyond, further still, she saw it, a crawling mass of armored vehicles, moving like black veins across the earth, spreading toward the base. 47 of them. Her targeting systems bloomed with red symbols, each one a potential death sentence for the people behind her. She breathed once, twice, steadying herself. She should have been terrified, and she was. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Not the manual, not the drills, something deeper. Instinct. A clarity she hadn't known she possessed. Base command, she said into her mic, her voice calm though her pulse thundered. Lightning 77 airborne. Visual contact with enemy formations confirmed. 47 vehicles. Initiating tactical assessment. Her finger hovered near the weapon's release. Her mind worked through vectors, terrain, vulnerabilities. And for the first time she realized this was no longer training. This was no longer theory. Every decision she made in the next few minutes would mean survival or annihilation. And yet, instead of hesitation, there was only the startling thought that chilled her as much as it steadied her. Why does this all feel familiar? How close can faith and fear sit to one another before they swap places? She had barely cleared the ridge when the first missile streaked up through the pre-dawn haze, fast, bright, asking for blood. It wasn't until the warning tone shrieked in her headset that she realized how near it had been. The radar painted the missile as a stuttering line converging on her aircraft, a cold geometry of intent. Her hands moved before she had time to weigh the math. Jettison chaff, jam the guidance, bank hard into terrain masking. The missile wavered, a second of angry correction, then a useless flare where its lock once was. It detonated in the scrub below, a bloom of orange she watched through the HUD while her own breath hung steady in the sealed cockpit. Her palms were slick against the side stick. For an instant she saw every face in the mess hall, the way Captain Rodriguez tapped his spoon against a mug in the mornings as if marking time, the way the sprinkler tech's daughter had laughed that last weekend. She had not come here to die in a metal shell while those faces blurred under artillery. She had come to buy them time. That thought, simple, ugly, incandescent, settled in her chest like a stone. The first engagement tested everything she had been taught and everything she had not. She ran through targeting solutions with the clinical speed of training. Identify, prioritize, neutralize. The tactical feeds made patterns out of chaos, revealing where the enemy had made the mistake of being predictable. They hugged the terrain in columns, tanks following tracks like obedient beasts, their spacing meant for mutual support more than flexibility. Doctrine had taught that protection. Doctrine had not taught how much punishment that mutual support could compound when exploited at angle and timing. Maya picked the SA-15 launcher first, the heart of their anti-air umbrella. If she could silence the shooters, the sky would remember its old name, freedom. The missile fired from a concealed tree line as if anticipating her choice, a streak that would have found her if not for the immediate deployment of electronic countermeasures synced to the F-35 systems. The jammer whispered in her ears, an unseen hand unspooling the threads the missile needed to find its mark. Her finger squeezed the trigger for the Hellfire, and the missile left the bay with the polite inevitability of rain. Impact, a churning of metal and fire. The launcher folded into itself and then into a spreading inferno. The blast threw up particulate like an answer in smoke. Maya held the view long enough to watch fuel trucks near the SAM site ignite and feed the new fire. Secondary explosions followed, feeding into one another like a bad rumor. 4 vehicles were gone before she even toggled her comm to report. In the operations center, monitors sprang to life with updated overlays as men and women leaned in, incredulous. Morrison's jaw worked while he watched the chain reaction come alive. No one could deny it now. A single jet was exacting an effect that Doctrine had said needed a wing. She heard the muffled voices over the line, the raw mixture of shock and a new, sharp respect. But respect was not a shield, and the world outside remained stubbornly lethal. She could have pulled away then, recalculated, saved ordnance for measured strikes. Instead, she found the rhythm of assault. There was a sequence in the chaos, a geometry in the enemy's mistakes she could read almost as if it were a language. They moved in channels carved by the terrain. They clustered at choke points where roads squeezed through ravines. Cluster munitions and cannon runs, she thought. Area effect equals maximum kill. The calculus was cruel but clear. Maya dove toward the nearest choke with engines keening. The cluster bomb release was timed so the submunitions would bloom in the valley below and shred not just armor but the soft parts, fuel drums, crew compartments, the things that make a vehicle more than metal. The submunitions rained down and the valley answered with a chorus of tearing metal. Artillery pieces toppled, their crews cursed aloud into open mics, and their vehicles, stretched and blackening, became beacons of neutralized threat. The radio was a staccato of updates. Overwatch gave grid corrections. Her sensors painted heat signatures like constellations of intent. Each ping indicated a life. Each locked target meant someone alive was closer to the chance of surviving. She toggled back to cannon when a cluster left a patch of surviving armor in a narrow sweep. The 25mm rounds chewed through reactive plating at close range in a way her training files had said was statistically improbable. She would later watch the gun camera, later listen to analysts dissect the angles. But in that moment there was only the hum of the stick, the lip of the cockpit window, and the bright bloom as rounds met tank after tank. The thrill of efficacy does not erase fear, it sharpens it. After the third run, the sensory flood receded enough for the human parts of her to catch up. Adrenaline is a treacherous mirror. It shows you yourself at your most noble and at your most animal. She felt both. The pilot's precise steadiness and a narrower thing, alarm that could have been mistaken for joy. She closed her eyes for half a second, and in that silence the weight of what she had done threaded into her bones. Engines, ordnance, trajectories, lives saved, lives ended. Her mind unspooled a dozen what-ifs. What if a missile had found its mark? What if the hellfire missed and struck the ammunition truck in a way that killed the prisoners of that vehicle's crew? What if her decision to take a risky, low-altitude run cost more than it saved? Combat is a teacher that prefers hard lessons and no second chances. On the comm, a voice cracked, a young lieutenant from the ground perimeter who had watched the first runs like a preying animal. Lightning 77, you're doing work up here. We can see them breaking. The southern approach is stalled. Gratitude tightened in Maya's throat like an old scar. She wanted to speak the language of relief. Instead, she found she was answering with something smaller, silence, because there was more to do. There was always more. The second SAM popped up and tracked with a vindictive swiftness that tasted like paper. Her electronic warfare suite sang again, and she deployed a maneuver that had never been in the training guide. Tilt into the tree line, present a narrow profile, kinesthetic tricking of kinetic systems. It worked. The SAM's radar could not hold a stable solution against the terrain, and the missile burned out of fuel on a wavering parabola. For a few seconds she felt invincible, then ashamed for feeling invincible at all. One moment imprinted into her memory, small and absurd and human that it almost didn't belong in a battlefield scrapbook. As she came up after a low pass, she caught sight of a child standing in a doorway near one of the peripheral villages. The child was covered in dust and fear and watched her as if she were a falling star. The sight hit her with a force that left her dizzy. It was a reminder. War is not only numbers and hardware. It is the shaking of hands, the small hands, the way a life can be rerouted by a single trajectory. She thought of those faces in the mess hall again and of how quickly they could be erased. Her chest moved in a slow, focused rhythm. She realized she'd been recording everything aloud as if the act of nomming it could fix it. Target 2 down, 2 SAMs destroyed, artillery neutralized, advancing armor at grid 44 slowed, returning for reinforcement on south flank. The voice on the line side, a sound that was almost a prayer. Stand down. Not yet, Lieutenant. Reinforcements on the move. North quadrant says tanks regrouping. The foe adapted. Men who are forced close enough to their enemy begin to learn one another's habits. They changed formations in the field, drew from every lesson they had to stop a single jet from undoing their plans. They began to hide in plain sight, ambushing support elements, scattering infantry, moving equipment into folds of the landscape where sensors were less precise. The math grew ugly. Every new tactic meant new risks. Her HUD blinked with the sharp, clinical recommendation of an AI that did not know what it felt to honor the faces at the mess hall. It suggested standoff engagements, high-altitude, measured hellfire shots. Caution was clean, and it would have saved ordnance. But there was a moral geometry she could not ignore. The ground crews on the perimeter could not trade altitude for time. The base would become a graveyard if the enemy ever held the fields beyond range for long enough to bring tank guns and artillery to bear. Her choice had to bias toward immediacy. Conserving was for a later day when nothing was already burning. She angled for a treetop run, the aircraft within the height of telephone poles, and heard the breath of the base on the radio. Voices braced for impact, for the world to tilt. The cannon thundered out and the burst tore through the column like a cruel, exacting scythe. Tanks, armored carriers, one after another, metal screaming into the sky, crumbled into smoking hulks. The landscape, which had been a map of enemy intent, began to look like a canvas painted with the cost of survival. There was a sanctity to the thing that left her weeping behind the glass, an odd physical reaction that came on like grief in tiny waves. She called in the hits slow and steady. Each confirmation was a prayer counted backward, vehicle destroyed, personnel incapacitated, artillery silent. The tally climbed, 12, 17, 20. The enemy formation that had carried terror toward their base was failing. The HUD, that sterile judge, displayed a final overlay, 47 no longer, 28. Numbers that in another life would have been abstract were suddenly very, very human. Between runs she climbed and the world would tilt into odd peacefulness. A wash of early light, the base a ring of tiny, scuttling figures, the sky blistering into color. Then she would dive again and the world would fill with noise and fire. The oscillation pushed against every private thing she'd held sacred. Her training, the manual, the memory of nights when she had woken in sweating sheets thinking of aircraft that wouldn't fly right. It demanded she be both precise and merciful in ways that had not been reconciled in any doctrine manual. After one violent sequence, a fragment of a transmission came through so small she almost missed it. Colonel Morrison to all, prepare for evacuation orders if perimeter fails. Repeat, pre-evacuation. Hearing it made something inside her crack. The thought that the base might be lost despite her runs lodged like a splinter. She had done much, perhaps enough, but the rest was no longer up to her alone. Command would move to protect what it could. There were lives that could be moved and lives that could not. The weight of that choice, who to save and who to leave, pressed on the inside of her ribs. For a moment she envisioned the possible futures, the base standing, the squadron resuming drills and coffees, the base a crater and the survivors making lists of names that would not return. Each was possible. Both required a kind of bravery of a different sort. She thought of courage not as a flash of glory but as the discipline to hold still where fear wanted her to bolt. That thought steadied her more than any instrument. By the time she made her fifth pass, the din had turned into a ragged retreat. The enemy command was breaking into fragments as messages came lighted with panic in foreign tongues. The commanders had become something more vulnerable than their tanks, human beings facing a decision they did not expect. To her left, a line of armored personnel carriers tried to form a perimeter to protect a withdrawal. She took one through with a cunning angle that let the hellfire chain into a parked supply transport. The subsequent conflagration blocked the road and trapped two more vehicles in the inferno. When she finally climbed away at a distance and the smoke trailed behind like a dark comet, she felt a kind of exhausted exhilaration that was not like anything she'd imagined. Her HUD pinged with a final mission update. All hostile targets neutralized. Lightning 77, return to base. The words carried through the cabin in deadpan format, the sterile voice of a system that did not know what the bombast of it meant. As she set a course back to Thunderbolt, the scale of what had been done began to catch up with her. There would be debriefs. There would be medals. There would be questions, technical, tactical, moral. She had performed in ways that would be parsed and praised. Yet beneath the accolades there was a quiet knot of unease. She had destroyed things, machines and people, but the victory felt less like triumph and more like a ledger that balanced on someone else's life. The smell of smoke had lodged in her nasal passages even inside the cockpit. In the reflection of the canopy, she saw her own face lean forward, tired and older somehow, eyes rimmed with something that might be grief. She thought of the child in the doorway one last time and wondered whether the war had simply rerouted the child's fate or stolen it outright. That small human image, unexpected and pure, would remain like a pin on a map, sharp and unignorable. Later, by the glow of the debrief room monitors, Colonel Morrison would sit before her with that same heavy look, and the conversation would be layered, tactical validation wrapped in moral question. For now, as Thunderbolt expanded beneath her like a world she had promised to defend, she let the silence be an instrument. She focused on the hum and let it carry her home. Sometimes, she found, the hardest flights are not the ones through fire, but the quiet glide back after, where you have to make yourself human again in the presence of those who did not fly and who will ask the most human of all questions. What did you do? What happens when the silence after victory feels heavier than the battle itself? Maya's wheels kissed the runway with a squeal of rubber and a hiss of braking thrust, the F-35 settling onto Thunderbolt's tarmac like a predator returning from the hunt. The aircraft rattled as though reluctant to be still. For a moment she let the machine idle, canopy closed, engines whining down, her breath fogging faint against the glass. Out there, beyond the shell, men and women had already gathered in clusters along the taxiway. She could see their faces, their mouths moving, their hands raised. Relief, awe, disbelief. They were all watching her as if she were something unearthly. But inside the cockpit, she was only one heartbeat away from shaking. Her hand lingered on the throttle longer than protocol required. She should have been thinking checklists. Power down, fuel cutoff, safety switches. But her mind kept replaying flashes of the fight. The missile that almost found her, the sudden eruption of secondary explosions, the child in the doorway staring at her jet as if it were judgment from heaven. Each memory pressed down harder than the weight of gravity itself. When the canopy lifted, the cool morning air rushed in, tasting faintly of burned propellant drifting from the perimeter. Maya inhaled as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Her gloves trembled as she unclipped the harness. By the time she stepped onto the ladder, ground crew were swarming the aircraft. Some slapped the fuselage in a wordless cheer. Others just stared. One sergeant gave her a look she had never seen before, a look reserved for those who had returned from the edge and carried back proof it could be done. Colonel Morrison was already striding toward her across the tarmac, his face drawn tight, eyes squinting against the rising sun. His boots echoed sharp against the concrete, each step heavy with unspoken calculation. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Then, with the entire flight line listening, he spoke quietly, almost reverently. "Lieutenant Henderson, that was the most remarkable display of close air support I've witnessed in 23 years." The words rang in her ears like a verdict. She should have felt proud, vindicated, triumphant even. But instead she only felt hollow, like the victory had drained something from her that she hadn't known could be taken. She gave a curt nod, her voice steady but low. "Thank you, sir." Morrison studied her, as if searching for the explanation behind what he'd seen on the tactical displays. "Where did you learn maneuvers like that? Those attack vectors, those were not in our doctrine." Her mouth opened, then closed again. How could she explain the sensation she had felt up there? That strange, unteachable clarity where chaos broke into patterns, where every vulnerability seemed outlined in red, waiting for her to strike. She shook her head slightly. "Sir, it felt instinctive, as if the answers were there waiting, not innovation, just obvious." The colonel's frown deepened. He glanced back at the operations center where officers were still replaying footage, freeze-framing strafing runs and ordnance impacts with wide eyes. "Instinct," he muttered. "You flew like someone with 10 years in combat, yet you shouldn't even." He stopped himself, exhaling. "Whatever it was, you saved this base. That much is beyond question." Maya gave no reply. She felt the stares of every mechanic, every radar tech, every cook and medic who had come to watch her step onto solid ground again. Yesterday, most of them had barely known her name. To them, she had been just the rookie, the textbook pilot, neat, precise, forgettable. Now she saw it in their eyes, something heavier than admiration. Expectation. Inside, she wanted nothing more than to crawl into a corner and breathe alone, to let her hands stop shaking, to cry, though she didn't know whether from fear, relief, or grief. But she stood tall instead, helmet tucked under her arm, face unreadable. The debrief room smelled of sweat and burnt coffee. Officers crowded around screens replaying her gun camera footage, pausing on impossible angles, rewinding to watch cannon rounds stitch through armor again and again. Captain Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, muttering under his breath. She reinvented close air support doctrine in a single engagement. Major Stevens, back from his classified mission, arrived mid-debrief. He had flown enough sorties to know what the footage should have looked like. Watching Maya's runs, he raised his eyebrows, then glanced at her across the table. "Lieutenant," he said slowly, "you broke every safety protocol we've ever drilled, and you turned it into an art form." Her reply was simple, almost flat. "Sir, the tactical situation demanded it. If I had followed protocol, the base would be gone." Stevens studied her, then gave a small nod that carried more weight than a medal. Adaptation under fire. The difference between survival and statistics. The words echoed in her chest, but she felt no swell of pride. Only a reminder. Every adaptation she made had left smoldering wrecks across the valley, vehicles with crews inside. Men who had been laughing at breakfast maybe in their own camps the way her own squadron had. They would never laugh again. After the formal debrief dissolved into chatter, Rodriguez approached her, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I owe you an apology." She frowned. "For what, sir?" "For underestimating you. For assuming that flying by the manual meant you couldn't improvise. We all thought you'd freeze when it mattered. You didn't." She shook her head. "You weren't wrong. I didn't know I could do it until I had no choice." His eyes softened. "No, that's where you're wrong. We're all measured at the edge. Most of us break the first time. You didn't. That's not luck. That's something else." The compliment left her colder than she expected. She wanted to ask him if something else was worth the nightmares that would surely come, the faces she hadn't seen but knew she had destroyed. But she stayed silent, letting the conversation slip away. 3 weeks later, they pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to her chest in a ceremony that felt like theater staged for history's sake. Cameras clicked. Speeches praised her tactical innovation, her efficiency, her courage under impossible odds. Maya stood at attention, her uniform immaculate, the medal shining like a lie against her heart. When the general read the citation aloud, "For extraordinary achievement during aerial combat that saved Thunderbolt Air Base from coordinated enemy assault," the room applauded. She smiled politely. But inside, she thought only of the child in the doorway, of burning trucks, of voices cut short in the fire. Recognition came swiftly. Her fellow pilots, once skeptical, now looked at her with a new measure of respect. Some called her a prodigy, others a legend in the making. To her face, they offered congratulations. Behind her back, she overheard whispers of a new call sign, Nightmare, a name born not from failure but from fear, the fear she had inspired in enemies who never expected a single pilot to dismantle their assault. But to Maya, the name felt less like honor and more like a mirror. She had become the nightmare. She had destroyed so much so quickly that entire doctrines were being rewritten in her shadow. And yet, when she closed her eyes at night, she wondered if being a nightmare was a curse disguised as a badge. The applause from the ceremony still rang in her ears as she sat alone in her quarters that night, uniform jacket folded neatly on her bunk. The medal gleamed faintly in the dim light, catching her gaze no matter where she turned. She picked it up, its edges cold against her fingers, and whispered to herself words no one else would ever hear. Sometimes victory doesn't feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like surviving a weight you can never put down. She set the medal aside, lay back on her bunk and closed her eyes. But the silence in her chest was heavier than any applause. What if the moment everyone starts believing in you is the very moment you stop believing in yourself? Word of her combat debut spread faster than she could have imagined. Tactical analysts dissected her gun camera footage in classrooms across the country. Instructors paused lectures to replay her strafing runs, pointing to her improvisations as if they were scripted lessons in innovation. Pilots who had once called her textbook now lowered their voices when she passed, some with respect, others with unease. And yet, for Maya, the applause only deepened the hollowness that had taken root inside. Thunderbolt Air Base hummed with a strange new energy in the weeks that followed. Where there had been skepticism, now there was reverence. Younger pilots cornered her in the mess hall, asking about angles, timing, split-second decisions she barely remembered making. She gave them answers, calm, precise, always professional, but each explanation felt like she was describing someone else. The person in those videos didn't feel like the same Maya who still woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heartbeat hammering, as if a missile were still chasing her across the dark. It was Morrison who summoned her one morning, his office dimly lit despite the bright desert sun outside. He sat behind his desk with a folder thick with after-action reports, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant," he began, "you know why you're here." She did, she nodded. "Command wants to see if what you did was lightning in a bottle or if it's repeatable. They're watching you now more than anyone else. They want you tested." Maya stayed silent. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice lowering. "They're sending you on a mission. It's classified. Different terrain, different stakes. No full squadron, no safety net. You'll be embedded with a joint task force operating in support of ground teams deep in contested territory. If this works, your tactics will become doctrine. If it fails," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Her chest tightened. It wasn't fear of dying, that was always the shadow in this work. It was fear of proving them right. The voices that had whispered her victory was a fluke, a desperate rookie's luck. What if the instincts didn't come back? What if she was only a miracle once? That night, alone in her quarters, she stared at the medal on her desk. The Distinguished Flying Cross gleamed back at her, mocking, heavy as lead. She whispered to the empty room, "I'm not sure I can do it again." The words tasted bitter, because part of her feared they were true. 2 days later, she was wheels up over a mountain range that cut the horizon into jagged teeth. Below her, the ground team moved like shadows, their voices crackling through encrypted comms. They were pinned down by mortar fire from a ridge line, their convoy trapped in a ravine. Her HUD painted the threats in red. Artillery pieces dug into rocky terraces, armored vehicles hidden under camouflage nets, infantry scattering like ants with shoulder-fired missiles. She breathed out, waiting for the clarity that had carried her through Thunderbolt, but it didn't come. Not immediately. The screen was chaos. Red everywhere. Too many options, none clear. Her hands tightened on the stick, waiting for instinct to whisper. Nothing. Only the pounding of her heart and the urgent pleas of soldiers below. "Lightning 77, this is Guardian 2. We're taking heavy fire, grid 76 Delta. We won't hold 5 more minutes without cover." Her throat dried. She had to act. She selected a Hellfire, locked onto the ridge gun emplacement, and fired. The missile streaked out, a line of fire cutting the sky, and impacted in a blossom of smoke and rock. Cheers erupted in her headset as the ground team seized the opening. But Maya's stomach twisted. The shot had been clean, effective, but not instinctive. It had been textbook. She rolled into another pass, cannon armed. This time she dove too steep, felt the lock-on warning shriek as an enemy SAM tracked her. She banked hard, chaff bursting behind her, the missile veering off into empty air. Her breathing was ragged. For the first time she felt clumsy, mortal, as though the grace of Thunderbolt had abandoned her. Still she pressed on. Pass after pass. Hellfires tearing through vehicles, the cannon stitching bursts across dug-in infantry, cluster munitions blooming over ridges. Slowly, the tide shifted. The ground team's voices steadied, moving from desperation to grim confidence. When the last mortar was silenced and the ridge burned black, Maya finally pulled up, her aircraft trembling with heat and strain. "Guardian 2 to Lightning 77, the voice crackled through static. "We owe you our lives. Couldn't have done it without you." She wanted to say something back, something brave, something commander-like, but she only whispered, barely audible even to herself. "I almost failed you." Back at base, the debrief was all praise again. Efficient, innovative, courageous. But Maya sat through it all with her jaw tight, replaying the moment she'd hesitated, the second she'd felt empty, the missile that almost ended her. She nodded at the compliments, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the Sam warning tone in her ears, kept seeing the HUD cluttered with red. The clarity hadn't come this time, not like before. Was Thunderbolt just an accident? Was she chasing a ghost version of herself that had appeared once and vanished? She walked the flight line in the dark, the hangars silent, the jets hulking shadows under the moon. She placed a hand on the cold skin of her F-35 and let her forehead rest against it. "Don't let me be ordinary," she whispered. "Not now, not after all this." But deep inside, she wondered if she already was. What if being called extraordinary slowly turns into a prison? The weeks that followed her second mission blurred into a rhythm that felt less like service and more like surveillance. Everywhere Maya turned, there were eyes. Officers she'd never met before watched her debriefs from the back of the room, their arms folded, expressions unreadable. Analysts handed her transcripts of her own comms, asking her to explain tone shifts, pauses, silences. Engineers combed over her aircraft after each sortie, searching for mechanical reasons behind her improbable survival. They found none. To the military machine, Maya was no longer just Lieutenant Henderson. She was a case study, a data point, proof of concept that a single pilot could achieve what doctrine insisted required an entire squadron. To her squadron mates, she was no longer textbook. She was legend in the making. To herself, she was unraveling. The missions didn't stop. They couldn't. Every time a ground unit faced overwhelming odds, her call sign was whispered like a lifeline. Nightmare. It had stuck, half respect, half myth. Enemy intercepts had begun using it too, some in fear, others with venom. Maya hated the name. She didn't want to be their nightmare. She only wanted to be enough. Her fifth sortie came at dusk, the sky painted in bruised purples and fatting gold. A convoy of Allied engineers was ambushed along a desert road, pinned by heavy machine guns dug into sand berms, mortars raining down from a distant ridge. Maya arrived alone. Again. She circled high, her sensors drawing out the web of threats below. The engineers were huddled behind their wrecked vehicles, sending frantic transmissions that barely cut through the static. The old clarity flickered in her chest, faint and brief. Then it vanished again, leaving only the textbook rhythms. She attacked by procedure, long-range hellfires first, then low-angle cannon strafes. The ridge burned, the berms collapsed. The engineers survived. But inside, Maya felt the same hollow ache. No instincts, no strange flow, only calculations and raw fear she fought to cage behind her calm voice. Afterward, when the convoy commander thanked her over comms, she managed a clipped copy that. But when she switched frequencies to tower, her voice cracked. She killed the mic before anyone could hear it. Back at Thunderbolt, Morrison called her into his office again. He didn't speak at first, just gestured toward the thick folder on his desk. Inside were reports, pages of her performance data, kill ratios, efficiency metrics. "Do you understand what this means, Lieutenant?" he asked finally. She stared at the numbers. They were immaculate, too immaculate, ratios that made her look like something more than human, numbers that would one day end up in textbooks. "It means I'm lucky," she said flatly. His eyes narrowed. "It means you're rewriting doctrine. Command is considering a new training program based on your engagements. Your techniques will shape how the next generation fights. Do you grasp the weight of that?" She didn't answer. She didn't want to. The weight of doctrine was what haunted her at night. What haunted her was the face of the child in the doorway. The silence after the ridge exploded. The split second where she thought the missile had her, and her last thought wasn't of glory, but of her mother's laugh when she'd first told her she wanted to fly. Later that night, Rodriguez found her on the tarmac, sitting on the edge of the runway with her knees drawn up, her flight suit unzipped at the throat. He sat beside her without speaking for a while. The desert air was cool, the kind that smelled faintly of dust and jet fuel. Finally, he said, "You know, legends are just people who survived long enough for others to tell their story." She looked at him, her face pale in the moonlight. "What if I don't survive long enough?" "Then you'll still be a story," he replied. But the real question, Maya, is whether you can live with the one you're writing now. His words landed heavy, because she wasn't sure she could. The following week, she was sent on another classified mission, this one deeper, more dangerous. Intelligence suggested a convoy of mobile missile systems moving through mountain passes, capable of cutting off entire air corridors if they weren't neutralized. She flew at night, the cockpit awash in cold green glow, the terrain below black and jagged. Each pass demanded precision, threading through canyons where the enemy could hide a launcher behind any rock face. This time the instincts came back, but differently. Sharper, colder. Her hands moved with confidence she couldn't explain, finding targets tucked into shadows before her sensors confirmed them. She launched hellfires with surgical accuracy, detonated one launcher so close to a cave mouth that the blast buried an entire infantry platoon inside. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Only action, efficient, ruthless. When it was over, she hovered at altitude, staring down at the canyon still glowing with fire. Her breath caught. The clarity she had longed for had returned, but it felt wrong. It wasn't grace, it was detachment. The kills had come too easily. She had felt almost nothing while she destroyed them. That terrified her more than fear ever had. Back in her bunk, sleep refused to come. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing again Rodriguez's words. "Can you live with the story you're writing now?" She didn't know. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Because legends aren't born only from courage. Sometimes they're born from damage, and she was starting to wonder which one she was becoming. What if the line between weapon and woman disappears so slowly, you don't realize it's gone? Maya's orders came sealed, hand-delivered by an officer she didn't recognize. He didn't salute, didn't smile, only slid the folder across the table and left her in silence. She opened it with hands she forced to remain steady. The words inside made her stomach twist. This was no defensive sortie, no close air support for friendly ground forces already in contact. This was preemptive, a strike deep into enemy-held territory, a mission designed to break their logistics before they could mount another offensive. And it wasn't a squadron tasking. It was hers alone. The target, an armored battalion assembling in a valley beyond contested lines, protected by integrated air defenses, camouflaged with decoys. A force large enough to crush not just a base but an entire sector if left intact. Command didn't want disruption. They wanted annihilation. When she looked up from the folder, Morrison was standing in the doorway. His face was hard, but his eyes were tired. "You've read it," he said simply. "Yes, sir." "They want proof again. Proof that you're not a fluke, that you can do in one night what normally takes weeks of coordinated operations. They believe in you, Lieutenant." She almost laughed. Believe. As if belief shielded you from missiles, as if belief rebuilt the faces of those lost. "Do you believe in me, sir?" she asked before she could stop herself. Morrison didn't answer immediately. His silence stretched heavy. Finally, he said, "I believe you'll do everything you can, and sometimes that's all we have." That night, as she walked the line toward her jet, the hangar lights humming overhead, she felt less like a pilot and more like a loaded gun someone else had aimed. The crew saluted her with reverence that tasted like superstition. She returned it with a nod, climbed into the cockpit, and sealed herself into the familiar cocoon of switches, displays, and soft mechanical hums. Takeoff was routine, but the weight in her chest was not. As the base shrank behind her, she whispered into the quiet, "Don't let me vanish in here." She wasn't sure if she meant the sky or herself. The valley appeared first as a smear of darkness, then as shapes blooming under her sensors, armored columns, artillery, radar trucks, the bones of an army waiting to move. Dozens of red symbols painted her HUD, shifting as the enemy convoy adjusted positions, unaware yet of the storm above. Her comm crackled. "Lightning 77, you are weapons free. Repeat, weapons free, execute at your discretion." Her discretion, the phrase felt poisonous. She selected her first Hellfire, locked on a radar vehicle at the valley's center. The missile streaked true, the explosion turning night into brief daylight. Chaos followed. Vehicles scattered, comms erupted in confused foreign chatter. She rolled into another pass, cluster bombs tumbling free, submunitions bursting across the packed convoy with terrifying efficiency. Fires spread. Ammunition trucks detonated like volcanoes, shockwaves rattling her jet. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like watching herself from far away, like her hands belonged to someone else. Each strike was precise, brutal, effective. Each one hollowed her out further. The enemy rallied faster than she expected. SAM radars snapped alive, locking her in crosshairs. Missiles arced up, white trails clawing at the sky. She wove through them with desperate maneuvers, countermeasures firing like flares of false hope. Twice the proximity warning screamed so loud her ears rang, once the heat bloom of a warhead scorched her jet's skin. Her breathing became ragged, panic clawing at the edges. But then the clarity returned. Sudden, icy, the world slowed. Angles appeared in her mind, patterns of movement, opportunities hidden in chaos. She was no longer dodging. She was dancing, weaving through fire like it had been choreographed for her. She dove low, cannon roaring, shredding missile trucks before they could reload. She climbed high, losing her last cluster bomb across artillery lines. She twisted sideways between ridges, baiting radar locks only to erase them with Hellfires fired blind but perfect. Hours blurred into minutes, minutes into seconds. When it ended, the valley was an inferno. The battalion was gone. "Base command," she said at last, her voice steady, calm, alien even to her own ears. "Objective neutralized. No remaining threats detected. Returning to base." The radio answered with stunned silence, then a voice thick with disbelief. "Lightning 77 copy. We copy." On the long flight home, the detachment dissolved, and everything she'd kept buried surged back at once. She felt sick, hands trembling against the stick. Her breath came in uneven gasps. For the first time since she'd taken to the sky, she felt less like she had won a battle and more like she had lost herself. When she landed, cheers erupted along the flight line, applause, smiles. She kept her helmet on longer than necessary, hiding her face until the noise quieted. When she finally climbed down, Morrison was there again, watching her closely. "You did what no one else could," he said softly. She met his eyes, hers dark with exhaustion. "Or maybe I did what no one else should." That night she sat alone in her quarters, metal still gleaming on the desk, untouched. She didn't look at it. Instead, she stared at her hands, turning them over, palms pale under the lamp. Hands that had killed hundreds in a single night. Hands the world now saw as salvation. She whispered into the empty room, "Am I still me? Or just the weapon they want me to be?" The silence answered nothing. What happens when the myth they've built around you starts to feel like a cage you can't breathe inside? Thunderbolt's hallways had changed. Where once people passed her with distracted nods, now every glance lingered. Mechanics stopped their work to watch her walk past. Junior pilots snapped salutes too sharply, their eyes wide as if looking at something more than human. Even in the mess hall, conversations hushed when she entered, plates paused halfway to mouths. To them, she was no longer Maya Henderson. She was Nightmare, a story made flesh. But stories aren't allowed to break, and inside she was splintering. Sleep abandoned her first. Nights were filled with flickering reels of fire and smoke, missiles tearing past her canopy, faces she never saw but could imagine burning inside the tanks she destroyed. She woke choking on air that smelled of jet fuel only in memory. Some mornings she found herself sitting at the edge of her bunk, helmet still in her hands, though she hadn't flown in days. Morrison noticed. He didn't say it outright, but his eyes carried questions. During one debrief, while analysts praised her efficiency ratios, his gaze lingered on her trembling hand as she lifted a cup of water. He dismissed the room early, left her alone with him. "You're carrying more than just the mission, Lieutenant," he said quietly. She wanted to tell him everything, The fear, the hollowness, the sickening cold clarity that now gripped her in combat like a vice. But she couldn't, because he would either ground her or worse, tell command. And then she wouldn't be Maya anymore. She'd be data, a failed experiment. "I'm fine, sir," she lied, voice steady. He didn't press. That almost hurt more. Her breaking point came on a mission that should have been simple, a convoy escort. Routine, they called it. She flew overwatch while armored vehicles rolled through a valley carrying supplies to an Allied outpost. At first it was quiet, almost too quiet. Then the first RPG flashed from the ridge. The convoy scattered, mortars followed, and her comms erupted with shouts, panic, pleas. She dove in hard, cannon fire chewing into rock, missiles streaking into hidden nests. The clarity returned, sharp and merciless. She flew like a blade, but then through the HUD she caught it. A cluster of figures fleeing from one of the destroyed positions. Heat signatures, small, erratic, not soldiers, not armed. Families. Civilians who had been too close, maybe forced to dig trenches, maybe caught in the fire. She couldn't tell. Her stomach lurched. Her finger froze on the trigger. Behind her headset, voices shouted, "Lightning 77, we need cover now. They're regrouping on the east slope." She had seconds. Fire on the slope, save the convoy. But if she strafed that ridge, she couldn't guarantee those fleeing figures would survive. Her mind split in two. The weapon wanted obedience. The woman wanted mercy. And in that razor-thin pause, she realized something terrible. They weren't the same anymore. She chose mercy. She pulled her angle wide, taking longer, exposing herself to enemy fire. The convoy took hits, vehicles crippled, men injured. But the fleeing figures disappeared into the darkness, alive. When she returned, the debrief was brutal. Analysts criticized her hesitation, her deviation from optimal attack vectors. Rodriguez confronted her in the corridor, anger masking worry. "You risked the whole convoy because you second-guessed the mission," he hissed. Her reply was soft, almost breaking. "I couldn't kill them, Rodriguez. They weren't combatants." He stared at her, jaw clenched, then shook his head. "War doesn't give us clean lines, Maya, you know that." But as he walked away, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Doubt not in her, but in himself. That night she sat on the runway, staring at the stars. For the first time, she questioned not her ability, but her place in all of this. If being Nightmare meant killing without hesitation, without thought of who burned in the fire, then maybe she didn't want the name anymore. Maybe being legendary wasn't worth being hollow. Her whisper carried into the dark, almost prayer, almost confession. If survival means losing myself, what's left to survive for? And the night, as always, gave no answer. What if the only way to keep your soul is to walk into the fire knowing you might not walk back out? The orders came at dawn. No secrecy this time, no folder slid across a desk. Morrison told her himself, his voice steady but edged with something like apology. Enemy forces massing again. Larger this time, heavier. If they break through, they'll take the valley, the base, everything behind it. Command wants you airborne immediately. No reinforcements, no support, you understand. Maya stood silent. She understood. She always did. But this time she felt no hollow surge of clarity, no instinctive calm. Only a weight in her chest, as if every mission, every kill, every sleepless night had gathered into a stone she carried alone. And yet she nodded, because what else was there to do? People were waiting. People who couldn't fly. People who still believed she was their shield. The crew worked in silence as they armed her jet. No jokes, no chatter, just hands moving over metal like priests preparing a sacrifice. Rodriguez appeared, helmet under his arm. His eyes were raw from lack of sleep. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "They won't let you up," she replied quietly. He looked down, jaw tight. "Then at least come back. Don't you dare let them turn you into a ghost while you're still breathing." She wanted to promise him. She couldn't. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder. Then she climbed into the cockpit and sealed herself inside. The takeoff was almost peaceful. The runway rolled beneath her, the sky opened wide. She climbed into the pale light of morning, the world below shrinking until it was only lines and grids and shadows. But she knew what waited: an army moving with precision, an enemy that had learned from its losses, that wanted her silenced more than they wanted the base itself. Her sensors lit red. Dozens, scores, tanks, artillery, mobile SAMs, all advancing in layered formation. It was enough to crush them all, enough to bury Thunderbolt in fire. Her comm crackled. Lightning 77, execute at will. Repeat, execute at will. Her finger hovered over the weapon's release. She inhaled, exhaled. This was the moment to decide whether she was their weapon or her own. She chose. The first hellfire screamed free, finding its mark with brutal precision. Then another, then another. Columns shattered, artillery burned. She dove and rolled, cannon thunder rattling her bones, missiles exploding against rock and steel. Enemy fire clawed up at her, near misses tearing the sky apart. Her countermeasures fired in bright flares, her jet screaming in protest as she forced it into maneuvers that bent its limits. But she was not hunting only victories. She was choosing. Every pass, every strike, she aimed not just for destruction but for mercy where she could find it. Supply trucks instead of fleeing foot soldiers, armored beasts instead of scattered heat signatures that might be families pressed into service. It cost her. Each hesitation invited fire closer. Twice, missiles skimmed so near the canopy that her teeth rattled. Once, shrapnel tore across her wing, alarms shrieking in her ears. Still she fought, not as a nightmare, not as doctrine, but as Maya. Hours felt like minutes, the valley filled with smoke, black columns rising into the brightening sky. Her ordnance dwindled, 8 missiles became none, cluster bombs emptied. Cannon rounds ticked down, each burst more desperate than the last. Still the enemy pressed. Still they came. Her HUD flashed red, fuel critical, ammunition expended. Below, the survivors of the enemy force began to retreat, their columns broken, their formations shattered. The valley was littered with wrecks, fire chewing through what had been an army. Thunderbolt would survive another day. But she wasn't sure she would. Her system screamed warnings: fuel bleeding, hydraulics compromised, radar still painting her as targets. She could eject. She could save herself. She could drift down into the smoke and pray rescue teams found her before enemy ground forces did. She looked once at the base far in the distance, its towers faint in the haze, its people waiting. Then she looked at the wreckage below, where one last SAM site glowed red on her sensors. Still alive, still a threat that could tear apart the next pilot who flew this sky. She knew what it meant. She knew what it would cost. She turned the jet toward the red icon. The alarm screamed. The fuel gauge dropped into nothing. The sky narrowed to a tunnel of fire. She pushed the throttle forward and whispered into the cockpit, words no one else would ever hear. Not their weapon, not their nightmare, just me. The jet dove. The last of her rounds tore free, cannon blazing, her body pressed hard against the seat as the SAM site erupted in fire. The explosion bloomed too close, the shockwave ripping across her wings, the jet shuddering in agony. For a heartbeat she felt the world tilt, the sky and earth trading places. And then silence. When the smoke cleared, Thunderbolt still stood. The valley was theirs. The legend of nightmare grew. But among those who knew her best, among the ones who had seen the tremor in her hands, the silence in her eyes, the story was different. It wasn't about tactics or kill counts. It was about a woman who refused to surrender her humanity, even when the world demanded she become something else. In the years that followed, cadets would study her battles, her maneuvers, her impossible victories. They would call her a pioneer, a tactician, a myth. But those who had been at Thunderbolt knew the truth. She wasn't a myth. She wasn't even a nightmare. She was Maya Henderson, a woman who fought not for glory, not for legend, but for the fragile right to remain herself in a war that wanted to take everything else. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.